So the chassis is an aluminum monocoque. For the most part, it's got steel substructure between the front suspension, just a little bit, and then a lot more steel around the engine and for the rear suspension. So in order to shape the aluminum for the chassis, I made my own bending brake. What I would have needed would have been $5,000, and a truck that wouldn't fit on the roads here would have to drop it off. So I made one for a couple $100, taking some designs off the internet. And it's pretty simple, but it got the job done. I made it the exact size I needed, so I'd already had my plans. I knew the longest piece I would need to put a bend in was 63 inches, so I made that one to be 63.5 inches. The aluminum's mostly 16 gauge, and then a lot of the inner panels are 20 gauge. The rivets I buy are rated for 500 pounds in tensile and 300 pounds in shear, I think. That's not, I found a real world application. Being in a car, there's vibrations, there's the bumps in the roads, there's vibrations from the engine. Those vibrations work the rivets out of shape. And famous Lotus race cars were known to have a certain rigidity when they were new, and they would lose about a third of that over the life of, or at least 1 or 2 seasons, just because the rivets would loosen up. Obviously, the original GT40, this would all be steel and would be spot welded together. So I did my own test for how strong the rivets were, where I made an aluminum pan, and I made a steel tube frame around it, and I riveted the pan to the frame, and the pan had sides that came up, and I riveted those sides in. And then I jumped up and down, sometimes on with 2 feet, sometimes on one. And what I'd do is I would jump 100 times, and then I jumped 10 times, slamming it as hard as I could, and I jumped another 100 times. And I did that 1,200 times. So basically I started with 2 rivets holding the pan on, and I broke it pretty quickly. And I weigh 180 pounds. Then I did it with 4, then I did it with 5, and then I did it with 6, and up to 8. But I found that 6 was enough to hold me for 1,200 jumps. And that it didn't fail at all. And I should say, when I say things failed, half the time it was rivets, half the time it was actually the aluminum panel, because the rivet was near the edge, which is how it often is. So anyway, doing the math, 180 divided by 6, I found that 30 pounds per rivet was kind of the safety mark that I want to have. And if I could have less, I actually would like to have only 10 pounds per rivet. And in some places it's 5, because I'm able to put just so many rivets in. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right, on the engine. Oh wow! Oh, bud, steer the other way. Thank you.
Attaboy.
This thing rolls nice.
You want to take it for a lap?
Kind of. The aluminum I use is 6061, which they would have used Alclad L72, which is in modern terms, is a 2000 series aluminum with copper in it. And that can't be welded, it has to be riveted. Because there's copper in it, it corrodes. And so they put a cladding on it, but anytime you cut it or drill holes, that's a place for corrosion to seep in. And because when I started building cars, I lived right off of the beach in Santa Cruz, corrosion's a huge problem. So I went with 6061 T6 aluminum, which isn't ultimately as strong as a 2000 series aluminum, but its strength to yield is actually a little higher. My chassis pulls a lot from the work Eric Bradley did before and after the GT40. So the GT40, their starting point was the Lola Mark VI, which was also done in steel, but that's because Eric Bradley was experimenting with steel, and spot welding was this great new way that they could make race cars instead of riveting. And if you look at the Lola Mark VI, it's very similar to a GT40 chassis, except everything's simpler. When Ford came in, Eric said, well, if we're really going to do this, we need to do it in aluminum, because race cars are made out of aluminum. It's lighter, you can get a stiffer structure out of it for the weight. And Ford said, no, we have more data on steel, let's make it out of steel. And then they proceeded to make it like you'd make a production car, where everything's going to be stamped. It's not really hand done. And GT40s were mass produced in race car terms. So every panel that had room has beads run through it. It's all super complicated. There's over 300 panels, separate pieces of sheet steel in a GT40. Where if you look at any other race car from the period that's in aluminum, there's no beads where there doesn't need to be. It's just straight. It's simple. You need it to be easy to be made, which makes it easy to be repaired. You want it to be light. Because the GT40 was steel, it was incredibly stiff. I've seen figures reported of 10,000 pounds per degree, and I've seen one reported at 23,000 pounds per degree of twist. And a good race car at the time would be 3,000 to 5,000. I mean, if you had 5,000, you were great. The downside to the steel is it was heavy. The GT40 was 22 to 2,600 pounds, depending on which version. And the Ferraris they were up against were 1,700 pounds. After Eric Broadley left the GT40 project and went back to making his Lola cars, he made the T70. And if you look at the T70's frame and the Mark VI's frame, you can see the evolution. And knowing that I incorporated some of those ideas into this, things like my car doesn't have seats that are separate from the chassis. You actually sit on panels that are stiffening the chassis, which happen to be in the rough shape of a seat, and there's padding on it. So original GT40 has over 300 panels. This has about 60, I believe. So just in general, a lot simpler. One place where I don't know why I did this, but I kind of started trying to be a little more accurate to a GT40 was in this front cowl bulkhead area where the dash goes. I made a pretty fiddly structure there to look a lot like how a GT40's is. And I mean, that was fun to do. I think from a design standpoint, I would have liked to do something more like the Lola T160. Can-Am cars, they've got more of a simple triangular shape to that. But, I do like GT40, so I am emulating it where I can. Besides wanting to do my own kind of ideas on the structure, which it's really close to a GT40, the principles are the same. In the details, mine actually the cockpit has more room for a taller person. There's more leg room, which then I've made it so that you sit more reclined, which then gives you more headroom. Something that if you're used to looking at GT40 chassis and you look at mine, you might wonder why it's a little different, is the very rear bulkhead where the rear suspension connects. Normally that's straight up and down on GT40, and mine's at an angle like this. And that has to do with the Ford T-Bird knuckles I'm using for rear uprights, because the way the suspension is going to need to attach to make those all line up right, the lower control arm attaching point has to be further forward in the car than the upper one. And so I just did the bulkhead at an angle, and I really wish I'd come up with that solution when I did the first car. So at some point I may chop off the back of the Indy car and actually do a bulkhead like that. One thing I wish I'd done that I didn't do is on an original GT40, there's a detail I didn't copy. There's this neat little structure that goes from the shock towers to where the engine mounts are. And it's a stiffening thing. It's so the weight of the engine pulls directly from the top of the spring perch. And I didn't do it because on the other car, packaging was really tight around the engine, and I had a lot of things where I thought everything was right, and I'd get the engine in, it's like, oh, I can't get to the starter, or the starter's rubbing up here. I've got to cut this out. And I just didn't want to deal with that, so I purposely gave myself as much room as possible, and I was a little worried about those structures being in the way of the headers. So I didn't do that. And obviously the car's fine. It handles great. It's super fast. But it's a neat detail from an engineering standpoint that I really like, that you can see that's got a clear load path and what it's meant to do, and I didn't do it. And something that I did on purpose and I'm probably going to change is, again, on the other car, I had a tough time getting the engine as low as I could. There's both packaging problems, and road car transmissions tend to have, on a transaxle anyways, they have the output shafts underneath the input shaft. So the engine comes in, goes through a set of gears, comes back through a set of gears, and with the ring and pinion, the output shafts are down below, which in a road car works because the engine's sitting up higher. In a race car, you want the weight as low as possible. So like a Hewland or a ZF from the time period would have the input shaft going through its gears and then the output shafts above, and that allows everything to sit lower and then have a nice straight axle line at ride height to the center of the wheels. Because I've got a Boxster transaxle, its output shafts are below. So I just have the whole assembly sitting up a little higher than it should for a race car. I had a number of problems when I did the IndyCar with packaging and getting the axle shafts to be in a good place. And I just thought, this car's just for fun. I'm just going to have it sit up a little high. I won't have those problems. I'll have plenty of access to get in and work on stuff. But looking at it now that it's all done, it looks like I could drop the engine and gearbox about an inch without having too much problems. There's a few things I'll need to change to make sure it's not fouling on things, but I think I could do it. And, maybe next winter that'll be my project. Between the first event and the second event, I changed the front springs from 400 pounds an inch to 450, and the rear I dropped from 600 to 500. And let me tell you, it was amazing. The car still would not understeer, but the oversteer was totally controllable. You could chuck it into a corner and just sort it out later, which was so much fun. The Indy car, you don't have to be super precise. You can overdrive it, but once you get out of shape at all, you lose so much time getting it back that it's frustrating. Whereas with the GT40, you can just always overdrive it that little bit and it's not going to bite you. You just correct and okay, I did that a little too much, but I'm right on the edge, which is where I should be. And it's just so much fun. Again, I brought other springs to try, but I didn't bother putting them in because it was amazing. I mean, it was great. I didn't want to mess up a good thing.
The interior is just the aluminum of the chassis. I painted it black to look like the pictures I had seen, and then later found out that the original chassis were painted dark blue. So, oh well. On original GT40s, especially the Works race cars, the seats were famously parachute material stretched across attaching points on the sides and had holes in them so that air could ventilate through. Modern reproductions, a lot of times they just put full fiberglass seats in. I did kind of a standard race car trick, which is what Eric Broadley did in the later Lolas, which is I made the seats part of the frame. You just are sitting on panels that stiffen the chassis, and I've got some padding on them. And this was kind of a quick first attempt. They work great, but GT40 seats are kind of iconic looking. So I think at some point I'm going to redo the actual seat padding so it looks more like an original. The stick shift on original is actually over here alongside the boom, which should be a gas tank. And on that side I have a gas tank going the whole way. This side I only have the gas tank to here so that I can put the shifter over here and have more room for a larger person, make it more comfortable. And also, I got a Boxster cable shifter to go with the Boxster gearbox. I made my own shifters on the past couple cars, and they've both been less than great. And so I wanted this to, if it had any problems, they wouldn't be my fault. And that's a bigger unit, so I needed to use this space here to put it in. So, if you know anything about GT40 dashes, mine doesn't look quite right, and there's a story to that. So I ordered the roof section and the dash from a supplier who sold parts for original GT40s, but he also made this fiberglass roof section, so that you could use his body panels with, say, a kit. And I ordered the roof and the dash were the first kind of body things. I was building the chassis, and I needed these to before I could continue. And I ordered them a little before Thanksgiving, and they didn't show up until March. And I asked for a right-hand drive dash, the way original would have, and a left-hand drive dash showed up. And so I thought, oh, shoot, it took, 5 months to get this here? I don't want to ship this back and get a dash who knows when. So what I ended up doing is cutting the dash up and then re-fiberglassing it back together so that the steering was on the other side. And because of that, it's a little wonky in that the mounting spot for a speedometer is on this side where it should be over there. But something I didn't even notice until after everything was said and done and I was looking at pictures is my dash came, before I cut it up or anything, it came with 4 spots for gauges along the side. There's a central 3-pod and then 4 on that side. And originals didn't have that. They had 3. So I don't know what's going on with that. But whatever. It works. I actually prefer the dashes they had in the Mark IVs and in the Mark IIBs, which were just the Mark IIs later on. When I set out to make the car, I didn't think I could get a Mark II body, and I thought, okay, if I'm doing a Mark I, I've got to do the Mark I dash because it's iconic. Everybody recognizes that. And then when I got the opportunity to make it a Mark II, I was a little bummed that I put so much effort into this dash because I really like the Mark IIB dash setup. It has that experimental aircraft look, or just general how a race car is, where it's just sheet metal with gauges and switches stuck in it. It looks really crude. It looks like a vintage race car. The roll structure, you'll notice from the video and pictures, I was driving it before it had this, and I added it. I wanted to get that in before I got it on track. It's a little inadequate, but it's better than nothing. And it does help tie the back and front together, although it's so narrow here that it's not adding a ton of rigidity. But it gives you something to hang on to when you get in and out, and that helps. And if you think GT40 doors are cool with their cutout things, just live with one for a week and you'll grow to hate them. That's just so much fun when you're trying to work on something. That and they hit you in the neck when you're getting in. That's always fun. Okay, so my kid was back with me, and this time we're at the Cow Palace in Daly City, which is known amongst the autocross community for its bumps and neighbors who complain about noise.
I love the cow.
Oh, yeah.
Back when I used to drive the Indy car, my kid always gave me grief because the other cars out there that were smoking their tires and getting really sideways, he liked that, and he said my car wasn't cool enough because I wasn't sideways enough. So I thought, okay, he must be loving what I'm doing in the GT40 because I am getting sideways everywhere. But no, instead he says my times aren't fast enough and I should stop purposely trying to screw up.
Set a fast time. Don't screw up. Don't purposely screw up. I know you like to, but don't purposely screw up. Get up, slide. Let's hope he's not trying to screw up purposely.
Which I wasn't. But I've always described autocross as the only sport I know that's more fun when you screw up than when you get it right. Because, now, not if you're competing at a national level or some big thing, but just at your regular local autocross, you get a really good time, great. Congratulations, that's cool, it feels good. But, no big deal. You know, you're driving around a parking lot. However, if you screw up and take a corner too fast and you spin out, everybody watching goes, woo! And you, yeah, and go on about your way. And it's fun. So when I'm watching the footage that my kid took of me back after the event, I got to find out the running commentary that he was putting on it as I was driving. And he's not totally wrong. The car was still really tail happy. I like it like that. I think it's fun, but I was kind of curious if the car would be faster, if there was a little bit better balance to be had. So for the next event, I was going to try stiffer springs in the front.
42.5.
Wow.
It's a fast car.